Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thanks, Jason. Great to see you.
So, Chuck, listen, you were in the Navy SEALs. More than that, you were a squadron leader. So, you've got lots of background in the military. More than that, you follow the war in Ukraine very carefully. So, recently, I've seen a lot of very alarming news as to what's going on in southern Ukraine. What should we make about it?
Well, the latest news is out of a large town, a very small city called Velyka, Novosilka. It was a place that has been associated with the ongoing struggle at Vuhledar, which is about 50 kilometers to the east. The Russians have been trying to take Velyka Novosilka for about 3.5 years. In this battle zone, conservatively, Russian losses are north of 50,000 casualties. So, about what the U.S. lost in the entire Vietnam War, just in this section of the battlefield. Ukraine has been fighting an attritional fight here, meaning they have stayed in the fight because this has been a very good place to kill Russians. That's what an attritional battle is. Within the last 36 to 48 hours, Ukraine has done something that is one of the most difficult things to do in modern warfare, and that is to break contact with the enemy, disengage, and retire in an orderly manner, which means the Russians rolled into what's left of Velyka Novosilka. Again, around this place, they've got 50,000 people in the ground. One of the things that makes this, if anyone were to try to cast this somehow as a Ukrainian defeat, I'd remind them to take a look at the maps before, after, and during this disengagement. Ukraine fought and held portions of the city for a number of weeks that Russia controlled every road into the city, but Ukraine still held it. They finally realized the game is not worth the candle, and the Russians have inherited another pile of rubble.
Typical. So, what else do you see on the map? What else has been happening in the last few days or weeks that you think is really important to take note of?
Well, one of the things I always keep my eye on is the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. They still maintain pretty solid control over an area larger than 400 square kilometers. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to get kicked out of Kursk this winter. Vladimir has missed his first deadline, which was 20 January. I guess he thought he was going to go to the inaugural balls. The Ukrainians are still holding on to Kursk. And when you look at the map of the Kursk incursion, you can see a series of converging highways within the Ukrainian salient, which means their ground lines of communication and supply are solid. I would say unimpeachable, as much as something can be unimpeachable in war. And we also know that the casualty rate for North Korean soldiers who entered the fight in Kursk, they've lost about 38% of their total number of force, which was about 10,000. And a recent estimate is that they've actually lost 40%, and that's 4,000 casualties. That's not a great debut for the North Korean allies.
But it seems, from what I've seen in the news, that it's not just the North Koreans. There could actually be Chinese soldiers already trying to help the Russians, placed within Russia, not yet on Ukrainian territory. But either way, a very bad sign if China really is becoming involved in the war. What do you think? Does it seem like it's probable, or is it just simply a rumor?
I tend to think we've taken a look at the videos. The gentleman is speaking idiomatic Chinese language, full command of the language. So who is he or they? Are they Chinese volunteers? I mean, was he a Chinese citizen who just flew to Russia and walked into a recruiting station? Has he any affiliation with the Chinese armed forces? I mean, we don't know. But the one thing I do know is someone is trying very hard to give you and I and everyone else the impression that the Chinese military is somehow involved in the Ukrainian war. I'm not ready to go that far yet, but I am willing to accept the videos that I've seen that we're talking about a person with Chinese language capabilities, not Korean, and listen to what he says, things like, let's go, I'm with you, let's fight. And you can see why the Russians would want to populate our ears with that message.
So it would seem, though, that Russia has had exactly the problems that we predicted this winter. The morale is bad, the soldiers are not happy, they're losing large numbers, just incredible quantities of soldiers being killed or maimed. So is this winter working out the way that you expected it to?
Yeah, it is pretty much. In places where you get these Russian gains, and I don't want to even call them gains, because we're looking at 420,000 Russian casualties over 2024, wherein the Russians, for all of that blood, treasure, equipment, material, fuel, ammunition, they captured a little bit less than Los Angeles County, right? So that's not winning. But they have gained in places. And for example, it's a good time to bring up Velyka Novosilka. Ukraine deciding there's no point in holding on to a town that the Russians control all the roads into. So as Ukraine finds these places that it can shorten its lines, and turning over Velyka Novosilka to the Russians, there's no place to go from there, right? They already have all the roads. They cannot go to the northwest. There are no roads. And there isn't even any cover, Jason. There's no trees. So it's going about the way I thought it would go. And unfortunately, as you and I spoke exactly a year ago, when Mike Johnson got himself in front of the gravy train and stopped it, this last year, 2024, has gone exactly the way you and I talked about it 1 year ago.
It is tragic. So looking ahead, though, what can Ukraine do? Do you see any signs that they're lacking what they need in order to win? Or do you see any signs that perhaps the Russian side is also lacking a lot of what they need to win? Who do you think's the most undersupported at this point?
Well, Ukraine is definitely the most undersupported. But I would say this, and this kind of turns the argument on its head. At this point, right now, the Russian armed forces are weaker than they have ever been since World War II. Well, why do I say that? Well, they're approaching 700,000 casualties in this war, right? Those are global war levels of casualties for 1,200 days, give or take, of fighting. They've lost almost 10,000 tanks, right? There are 4 or 5 major NATO allies that Russia has lost the equivalent of their entire armed forces. Everyone in the Royal Navy, Marines they're all dead. All of the tanks that Britain owned, dead. The same with the Italian army, the German army. You can see they burn through the armies of 3 NATO partners and equivalent. So the Russian force, even though it is moving inconsequentially, the territorial needle, the apparatus, the armed force, the gizmo is giving out. It's being hollowed out. I am hoping that the United States, and it's going to take a world leader to step in and change the supply dynamic, to put Ukraine on the offensive, and then we're going to see just how much army Putin has left. And it isn't that much.
So, Chuck, we talked a lot about the fact that the Russian military has suffered with very low morale and that this winter was going to be especially bleak. Now, what signs should we look for that the morale in the military is falling apart? Or what signs have you seen that it's very, very low in the Russian military?
Well, there are a number, and here's one to lead with: self-harm within the Russian military. Okay, traditionally, if you wanted to get out of military service and you're in the front line, you shoot yourself in the foot, right? Or you shoot yourself in the hand and you get taken off the line, right? This is what malingerers have done since the Napoleonic Wars. It's an indicator. And, unfortunately, there are lots of videos that people can see on the internet, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Russian soldiers killing themselves, not shooting themselves in the foot, killing themselves. Why? You shoot yourself in the foot, they're going to give you a pair of crutches and continue with your career in the battlefront. These people are killing themselves because they are absolutely without hope. There's going to be no rest, no rotation, no hot food, no reinforcements, no nothing. Okay, that's one indicator. Second indicator is the gulf between the rank and file Russian soldiers and their command structure, right? These soldiers know they get briefed up for an operation, and these are the scientific numbers. Every time a Russian force comes in contact with a Ukrainian force, the Russians lose somewhere between 30 and 100% of the force. Okay, nobody wants to see the colonel come down and give a brief, which is why we have dozens of examples of colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels, captains, lieutenants being killed by their men. Wow. We've even seen it at recruiting stations where a recruit pulls something out of his pocket and starts killing as many people as he can. Again, these are the signs of an army and an organization that's in its end state, right? What's another thing I look at? You drive 100 Russian vehicles into contact with the Ukrainians, 38% of them are abandoned by their crews. They don't fight. They stop, open all the hatches, and run away. Okay. This isn't what winning looks like. So you take all the morale problems and now you add the toughest season to fight a war, which is winter, right? General winter. The climate is your enemy. And Ukraine, as you know, they've got a lot of winter left. So we'll see how it's going for the Russians. Come the worst month for me is March. That's the worst month.
And why is that? Why is March the worst month?
Well, you get this miserable hope that the winter is over, and it is not, but you'll get 3 days of rain and then 4 days of ice cold temperatures. It's the time that the roads all get churned up in mud and then freeze into those crazy shapes like badly laid concrete. And there is a real problem in the winter when a shell hits hardened earth that's as hard as concrete. It's like shrapnel. And a shell that might do little damage in the summertime landing in a plowed field, in the winter, it's like hitting concrete. But these are all problems that the Russian military knows very well, right? Their guys are cold, tired, miserable, and frankly, they're fed up. So we'll see. There is going to be a collapse. It's going to absolutely happen. When? I can't say yet, but I promise you, there's going to be big unit-wide collapses in the Russian armed forces.
Well, it certainly seems that things are not going very well for the Russian military. Do you think that there is a strategy or a plan that they have where they could still take Kyiv? And how would that look?
Everything in my training has taught me to never underestimate your enemy. Never. Always assume he's smarter than you and he knows twice as much as you do. But I'm going out here and it's not very far on a limb. This war is unwinnable for Russia. They don't have a spring offensive planned where they are going to roar across the frontier in 5 places and converge on Kyiv. They are no longer capable of conducting coordinated large-scale ground maneuver operations. They can't do it. Who am I? I mean, okay, Chuck, yeah, says you. The biggest operation that I monitored lately, and there's been some other big ones, but I like pointing about this one. Up in Kupiansk, the Russians sent a battalion-sized force, notable for its size, 900 people, to get to the Oskil River. They approached in a group, mass, that's good, one of the principles of warfare. As they got to the river, they split. Okay, now they've got half as much force. They maneuvered and they put a swamp between the 2 prongs of the attack. So they're no longer supportable. They kept probing at the Ukrainians. 22 minutes later, Jason, they were all dead. 900 Russians annihilated in 22 minutes. Okay, that was not a one-off. They're not capable of doing this anymore. They've got no Omar Bradleys. They've got no George Pattons. They've got no General Grants. They've got a bunch of clowns who've been in on the military grift. They lack the command bandwidth and talent, and their soldiers are tired, wrung out, undertrained, and there's nobody from corporal to colonel general who can pull this off anymore. This war's a quagmire for for Putin.
Well, it seems it's not just on the battlefield. We've seen in recent months that it's been said that Ukraine has been able to assassinate Russian soldiers and Russian officers looking at other countries, including within Russia, but also in Africa. And it actually sort of reminds me of some of the stories you've told me before about your time in the Navy SEALs. So, what have you seen the Ukrainians doing recently internationally? And what have you yourself done that might have some parallels to that?
I'll start with the historical background. So, in the mid to late 80s, there was a big section of my portfolio as a SEAL Team 6 squadron leader. There were a lot of Russian based, funded, trained terrorist groups like the Bader Meinhof gang, like the Brigade Rose, like the Red Army faction. These were they were revolutionary Marxist organizations, but they were nihilistic terrorists. These were people who were shooting up airports. They were hijacking aircraft. They were hijacking cruise ships, although that was the PLO. We spent a lot of time deployed in foreign countries stalking these enemies of NATO and bringing them to book, I would say. But what we've seen in Mali, which is another place in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things Putin was able to do after the Wagner mutiny, he took all these people and he sent them to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to the dictator du jour, where Wagner provides security and slave labor management for the exploitation of natural resources. In something I loved to watch, this a couple of months ago, we are getting all this film out of Mali, and it showed drone warfare and snipers and special operations activity directed against Wagner advisors to the dictatorship. That's what rang a bell with me. Those are exactly the kind of things when you have boys trained to the level of General Budanov's men, you can send them into these countries and they can prosecute these targets. What's so interesting to me is, this changes the balance. Those Wagner guys thought that Mali was a permissive environment, right? They were just going to go there and go into villages and fix bayonets and make everyone work in a gold mine. But that didn't happen. So one thing I wanted to ask you, we focused a lot on Ukraine, but there are a lot of places in the world where things are going bad for Putin right now. Not just in Syria, not just as we spoke about in Mali, but also in the traditional sphere of Russia. And I'd love you to consider that because that has an effect on the war in Ukraine.
Sure, absolutely. The fact is, things are not going very well for Russia. And just like we saw when the Soviet Union collapsed, there became a point where it usually had influence, specifically in Eastern Europe, but it was no longer able to, economically or militarily, prop up the regimes there. And they eventually fell. Now, we saw what happened recently with the downfall of the Assad regime in Syria. Assad, they were sure was solid. They had put a lot of money and a lot of time into his regime. But you know what? It fell. And so, what that means, it has consequences. Obviously, it means that they're not going to be able to help their partners in countries like Niger, in countries like Burkina Faso or Mali, all countries where they assisted in overthrowing the governments there. So that puts them on the outs. But then in the former Soviet space, let's look at that. In Eastern Asia, or sorry, Central Asia, we've seen a big change there as well. Countries there are becoming more and more distant from Russia. They realize that Russia poses a threat to them. And who's moving in? The Chinese. The Chinese realize that this is a golden opportunity. Russia simply doesn't have the capacity to be providing the support that it was able to before. And more than that, who's taking economic advantage? There's lots of Turkish businessmen moving there as well. As you know, Central Asia is Turkic. And so what is happening is that Russia is being sort of pushed off the grand chessboard. We look what's happening in Latin America. We see similar things there. We see that the leftist governments that have been countries like Argentina are no longer in power. In the case of Brazil, we see it moving in the same direction. In the case of what we see happening in Nicaragua, where they've been thrown out a lot of foreigners because the dictator there is just afraid that, you know what, Russia's not going to be able to back me anymore. We see in the case of Cuba, their entire power grid is expected to go down at some point in the near future, a country that always depended on Russia. So when we look at what's happening across the entire chessboard, we see what's going on. There's no way that somebody could argue that Russia is in the state to be able to expand or to be able to do more. In fact, aside from the long term historic relationships it has with many countries due to the Soviet Union, outside of that, it's not developing new friends. And it would really seem that the Chinese are just sort of taking advantage of the situation. And though they say that they're friends and allies, we don't see them jumping out to really put their lives at risk or to really risk even economic relations with the United States or with Europe. So I don't see how somebody could come to the conclusion that Russia is an ascendancy. Quite the opposite. It would seem that Russia right now is in a very bad state and it's getting worse. So, what do you think, though? Do you think it's really possible that going ahead, the Chinese are going to try to change the dynamic and that they will become involved more deeply? Or do you think it's just going to be, as we saw today, the rumor that there's a Chinese soldier or soldiers who might be inside of Russia for training or assisting the Russian military? Do you think that the Chinese would really ever go all in?
I don't think they would. And again, this is, you and I talk about the wilderness of mirrors, which used to be, of course, espionage, but now information and information warfare is the wilderness of mirrors. Russia wants desperately to give the impression that China looks favorably upon its military adventurism in Ukraine. Okay. There's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm very glad we got to wander over here and talk about this. There are a lot of foreign policy and geopolitical reversals for Russia. Losing Syria was so important because now they've got to make completely different arrangements to support their imperial ambitions in Africa, right? Syria was the perfect place to do that. The intermediate stop, not anymore. A little bit of number that I loved, couldn't believe at first, Defense Intelligence UK stating that 95% of Russian military capability is directed into Ukraine. That leaves 5%, which is the maintenance number, of capability to respond to any other place in the world where it has strategic interests. So something goes totally sideways in Burkina Faso, things are bad for Russia. They can't do anything about it. What will China do? I think China is going to just watch Russia wheeze and hump and clatter uh, down the road of their own diminution. And again, Putin is totally in control of this monolithic Russia until the instant that he isn't. And the whole thing is going to fly to pieces. Just as we watched the Soviet Union fly to pieces in the course of what, 10 days? So you and I lived through that again. And Putin gets up every morning and hopes, I hope I don't wind up like Ceausescu, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. Just name the dictators, Caligula. It goes back that far.
So I think you're absolutely right. And the only thing that he really worries about is his own security. We see that Vladimir Putin obviously doesn't care about his own citizens or what's best for them. And he doesn't care about his own soldiers. He cares about Vladimir Putin first and foremost. So it must be very hard, though, all the same, when he looks around and sees that part of Russia today is being occupied. And incredibly, Ukraine continues to strike using drones throughout Russia. Specifically, Ryazan has been taking a lot of hits. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this is, we've got something coming out for the Kyiv from on this exactly. Drone warfare is coming out from the Kyiv Post this week on the latest point of impact. This is the first time in history that any nation without a strategic air force, without a bomber force, has carried out strategic air campaign against another nation, and it doesn't have an air force. So it's a good thing to get on Ryazan here just for a moment. It is sort of the highlight of a very active strategic drone attack month, the month of January for Ukraine. they have hit the fuel oil, the oil distillery at Rizan, the bunkering and storage facilities, and critically, the pumping arrangements and the nearby power station. What that has done is it started fires. They've destroyed distillation equipment. They've started fires in the storage areas, and by destroying the pumping station, Russia can't drain threatened oil tanks. They just have to sit there and wait for them to burn. With the power station out, it's very difficult for them to combat the fires. One thing that, again, I'd like people to realize this as well. They hit Razan earlier in the week, then they hit it again, and they're likely hitting it again a third or fourth time as you and I are talking. And here's a little victory that is underscored. They are clobbering Razan because there are no more Russian air defenses there. That is a naked, wide open target. And this is also the modus operandi of Ukraine. They the fast-moving turbojet rocket-powered drones like the Plantier come in, whack out the sensors, whack out the air defense in classic suppression of enemy air defense, and then in come the strike zones, timed to the second. So Putin's also watching his biggest moneymaker go up in flames. And I'm always glad to see that because he's all about the money.
Ultimately, that's it. Vladimir Putin is interested in money. It's self-interest. And his country without money, it has big problems. Keep in mind, the Russian economy itself is really on the brink, and it's not clear what's going to happen next. And that's probably one of the best things that I see happening right now for Ukraine is simply that Russia's capacity internally is diminished. Every day it's getting worse. And at any point, we could expect to see hyperinflation or some sort of other economic disaster that would simply take the Russian military off the chessboard. So, what else are you seeing now, Chuck, that we should be paying attention to?
I don't expect any major military changes until possibly the height of summer. I see Ukraine in a defensive posture, although that isn't quite the way it sounds. They're fighting attritional battles. And one thing you never want to be in any sort of combat situation is you don't want to be predictable, right? You don't want to have a tell. You don't want to, telegraph your haymaker. You want to be unpredictable. But the Russians are never unpredictable. They conduct daylight attacks in mid-morning along the same avenues of approach, and they do it again and again and again, and they get their butts kicked. So by saying, and it's technically true, that Ukraine is on the defensive, look at the red contact points everywhere along the zero line. That means the Russians have shown up and they get their butts kicked. The Kremlin doesn't want to hear that the local commander is not attacking. So they are wasting their resources, manpower, fuel, vehicles, ammunition, everything up in smoke, conducting hundreds of pinpoint attacks that aren't working. And Jason, they are unable to unite those forces and conduct large-scale operations. I haven't seen one. The largest one I saw was 18 months ago, a sixth-prong attack around Kremenna, and it was sequential, right? Not all together. 1, 2, 3. They can't do it. They don't have it. It isn't going to happen. This is Vietnam, 1970, and who's going to win the war? Well, it isn't going to be Uncle Sam.
So, overall, though, one of the things that you've mentioned before, and I think is a very interesting thing, is the role of drones in this war. So, let me ask you about that. What is the role that drones have played? What's been the most unexpected aspect of that? And what else do you see?
The most amazing thing to me is that 1,000 days ago, nobody at the Rand Corporation, nobody at Raytheon, nobody, no evil genius at DARPA, nobody thought that a first-person drone with an RPG warhead on it was going to become the most viable anti-tank weapon that exists on the battlefield, right? Why would Raytheon think of that when when a Javelin missile costs $270,000 and a FPV drone all in costs you $2,000? Uh, Ukraine's use of drones, both as surface warfare devices, they functionally defeated the Black Sea flotilla. It is in Novorossiysk. It's never coming out again. Uh, and the capability and the capability of the Ukrainians to push the technological envelope, and also the capabilities of these drones that can do everything from hunt an individual soldier on the battlefield, hunt an individual vehicle, to traveling 1,000 kilometers into Russia and hitting a 20-story building on the balcony of a specific target they want to engage. That is like H.G. Wells stuff. And none of it, we're so used to it now, none of it happened before. It's the most important weapon system I think that Ukraine has, and it is vital. It is a force multiplier. It is the rocks in David's sling. It's so important that they have them, and it's so important that they get more of them.
I agree with you. Drones are absolutely critical for Ukraine. So, are they receiving enough of them now, or what's your analysis?
The Ukrainians are on par to be producing 30% of their own armament needs within a year. That leaves 70%. Uh, Ukrainian drones are the best in the world. If you were a general in some foreign nation, you're going to want the systems that Ukraine has produced that have proved themselves against the best Russian countermeasures, et cetera. Uh, it's something that is the marker of this war. Analogous to the Spanish Civil War, that was the precursor to World War II. We saw the debut of all of the weapons, the tactics, the changing modalities of war. We got a foretaste of them in the Spanish-American War. There's still a lot of the 21st century left, right? 80 years. War going forward is going to look like some variation now of the war in Ukraine. But you ask what those wars are going to be like, it's going to be drones, 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 drones.
Absolutely the case. And as you know, Chuck, right now I've recently started trying to help the Ukrainian military to get more drones. When I was in Kursk, Russia, I was able to go with a friend of our organization who's been on the Kyiv post before to deliver drones to the Ukrainian soldiers. These drones, which are not being used to attack Russian positions, but to defend the lives of Ukrainian soldiers by identifying where the Russian positions are and also to help with medical evacuations. It's critical in saving the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. And that's why, below this video, I'll include a link to that fundraiser as we are trying to preserve the lives of Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting for the freedom against Russian fascism. So, Chuck, it was really great to see you today.
Hey, thanks, Jason. Good to be on with you, and stay safe. I'll see you again.
See you soon, Chuck.